I will share. All right, so thanks for everybody for showing up here. This week we have Scott Fenwick, who's going to talk about some regulatory impact of SAF and how that affects renewable diesel production. I think I've mentioned this at a few of the other talks. You can tailor your production to one fuel or another at the expense of the others. So you can have more SAF, which would theoretically give you a lower yield of other products. Yeah, so first, though, I will offer a little bit of an introduction again. Some of you have seen this many times, and it's not new to you, but there are always a couple here that are new to these. So I want to recap that most of these calls, as many as I remember to record over the last 2.5 years, are on YouTube, and we've covered many topics. So we have basic intro level 1-hour discussions. I've talked about production, environmental impacts of production of renewable diesel, availability and pricing we've discussed, maintenance considerations. We've focused on cold weather on some of the talks. We've had 2 or 3 specific for ski resorts, so we have some of those recorded. Emissions, present and future feedstocks of renewable diesel. If you want to see what the future could hold for feedstocks for renewable diesel, we did a talk on that. Fleet testimonials, we've had different fleets explain and talk about how it's worked for them. And then we've had many representatives like Scott. We've had people from refineries. We've had somebody from Calumet or Montana Renewables speak to what they're doing. We've had retailers. Parkland Fuels has spoken at 1 or 2 of these. We've had distributors and other experts from Neste. We've also had some manufacturers of snow groomers from Europe join some of these calls. And then I've given 1 or 2 discussions on sustainable aviation fuel. So it's not totally new what we're going to talk about today if you've been to all of the talks, which I don't think most of you have, but it'll be great to have a different perspective. I'm going to offer just some introduction again. This is almost every talk I have that renewable diesel is not biodiesel, and I offer some comparisons here. Specifically, and I guess most prominent that I always mention is the cetane value of renewable diesel versus petroleum diesel. The completion or the effective, the completion of combustion, the thoroughness of combustion can be sort of related to the cetane number, and renewable diesel has a much higher cetane, so it burns more completely than petroleum diesel. Also, the stability of renewable diesel is much greater than petrodiesel. So those are 2 of the big, aside from the environmental aspects, those are 2 of the big properties I think that are superior for renewable diesel. Again, in our region, we have 4 refineries. We have 1 in Great Falls, there's 1 in North Dakota, and there are 2 in Wyoming. The 1 in Great Falls, which is Montana Renewables, opened in late 2022. This is a slide from back then, and I'm trying to just illustrate that they essentially cut the production in half and continued to do petroleum products, and the other half is now renewable products. And Krista's on this call, and we're talking about having her possibly give a sort of a presentation next month on on whatever she wants, really, but a little bit of a focus on the wastewater production from pretreatment of the oils. It's been a concern in Montana, and I think we can help clarify and get some information out there to help everybody better understand it. We spoke on the phone, I think, yesterday for almost an hour, and I learned a bunch of things that I didn't know. So I think we'll all learn something. Quickly, just chemically, the difference between renewable and petroleum diesel. Petroleum diesel is a complex mixture of a bunch of different hydrocarbons, and I represent that with these different molecules, aromatic hydrocarbons. There's some metals in petroleum diesel. 25% of the makeup of petroleum diesel are these aromatic or metal-containing compounds, and maybe 3/4 are linear hydrocarbons. Renewable diesel is essentially a subset of these molecules. It's a a very narrow range of these linear hydrocarbons. They could be branched. I'm just trying to represent them here. So you could almost say renewable diesel is petroleum diesel because it's essentially contained within the makeup of petroleum diesel. So when you burn these two products, you can see on the left, the petroleum diesel with that complex mixture of molecules produces a lot of soot. And on the right, in contrast, it burns very cleanly. Also, some of you may know when you smell diesel, it smells like diesel, but renewable diesel almost has no smell. So it burns clean as well. There are a lot of benefits to renewable diesel in terms of maintenance of your vehicles. This can be found on our YouTube page. This is Chuck from Vancouver, Washington. He runs the fire fleet, the fire department fleet over there. And I think this is about 2 years old now. So they've probably been using renewable diesel exclusively for 3 or 4 years. And he has a lot of things he says that he's noticed firsthand. And that includes less soot in the bays when the vehicles are idling, way fewer diesel particulate filter regens. They would have an issue every week with 1 or 2 vehicles, and that went to 0. Their fuel filters in the vehicles and the tanks are lasting longer. And then he said he's seen more power and cleaner injectors. And on average, that equates to about 5 hours of maintenance per vehicle per month. So it was huge benefit for him. And you can hear him say all this if you go to our YouTube page. Skip it if I can. Yep. This is one of my last slides, but what I'm trying to show here is this is pulled from a presentation for Idaho National Lab. They have 90 motor coaches that go out to the desert every day, and they are diesel. They have a couple electric, or at least they did last year. As a comparison for emissions wise, this fleet of 90 buses, if it were to use, I guess I deleted the picture right here. Click it. Oh, there we go. If they use 45% renewable diesel, which is what they were using at 1 year, they were using 100% all winter or all summer and 0 in the winter. So it equated to an average of 45. Using the 45% renewable diesel in this fleet of 90 buses has the equivalent reduction of emissions as replacing 30 of those buses with electric buses. So you can have a great carbon emission reduction just by using renewable diesel in your existing fleet. The other way to look at that is by using 1.5% renewable diesel in this fleet, it's the same as 1 electric school bus in terms of emissions. So the cost is very low for that large reduction of carbon emissions. So that's it. You can hold the questions to the end if there are any, but so Scott Fenwick he's probably been on a couple of calls, but we spoke at one that I had canceled, but he showed up and we spoke for half an hour and found him to be one of the more knowledgeable people I've met with renewable diesel, and he agreed to give a discussion from his perspective. And so it'd be nice for me to learn something and hear somebody else talk for once. So with that, Scott's with Clean Fuels Alliance of America. So I think they promote a bunch of different fuels, including renewable diesel. So let me pass this over to you, Scott. I will give you control.
If that helps.
Does that work?
Yep, absolutely. Perfect. Appreciate it, Jesse. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Fenwick. As Jesse said, I work as the technical director for an organization, Clean Fuels Alliance America. And so we are the domestic trade association for renewable biomass-based diesel fuels. So our stakeholders, our members represent biodiesel, renewable diesel, and now sustainable aviation fuels as well. And so as technical director, I work pretty closely, not just with our member organizations, renewable fuel producers, but also the petroleum industry. I've been in the fuels business, petroleum chemist in the Gulf Coast originally for over 35 years. I have been just about every aspect of the fuels industry you can think of, from production and working in refineries, managing laboratories, in the distribution side, in charge of rail and truck distribution as well for a producer organization in North and South America, and then joined what is now Clean Fuels Alliance America, formerly the National Biodiesel Board, about 13 years ago. So I also had the privilege of serving as the recent past chair of ASTM Committee D2. ASTM is a international standards development organization, and Committee D2 covers petroleum products, liquid fuels, and lubricants. So I want to talk with you today about the renewable side of this and SAF and what SAF is and is not. To most people, SAF is sustainable aviation fuel. In my world, on the technical side and within ASTM on standards development, it's not sustainable aviation fuel. It is synthetic aviation fuel. And I want to explain why about that as well. So ASTM standard D1655 is that standard specification for aviation turbine fuel. And it actually defines jet fuel as derived from conventional sources, including petroleum crude oil and other petroleum sources. So there is a regulatory requirement. ASTM doesn't enforce this, but anybody that then adopts this, and this is standard, can be found in federal regulations, state regulations, as well as all over the world. Anybody that adopts this, there is this regulatory definition then that jet fuel must be produced from petroleum. All other feedstocks require an approved pathway, and those can be found in a different standard, ASTM D7566, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. So if you make jet fuel from anything other than a petroleum source, it becomes a synthetic aviation fuel, and only a subset of those then would be sustainable. Germany was a good example in World War II, where they took coal and turned that into a liquid fuel where they used to power their vehicles. That would be a synthetic fuel. If it's used in an aviation application, it'd be a synthetic aviation fuel, but making it from coal, it would not have been sustainable. So the previous administration here in the US did define it as sustainable aviation fuel. This current administration changed that definition, that acronym, to now be synthetic. And so as I mentioned, to be sustainable, there is a regulatory requirement that you reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50%. And those are calculated using life cycle analysis. Everybody refers to it as the GREET model here in the US, developed by Argonne National Lab. So it could be, you may hear the acronyms as well, in addition to SAF, SATF for synthetic or sustainable aviation turbine fuel, renewable jet fuel, all the same. And so here's one bullet point that I hadn't yet finished working with a colleague of mine here in Clean Fuels, Veronica Bradley, who does our environmental sciences work. Because there are multiple different kinds of SAF, we want to talk about HEFA. What the industry calls that is a hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. It is the most common, the only commercially available SAF in the marketplace today. Basically means sustainable aviation fuel made from commercial fats and oils. So vegetable oils, animal fats, used cooking oil and such. And so using that, there are some mandates in Europe currently that require a 2% blend. And so how much carbon does that actually reduce? It's interesting to note that aviation emissions on a global basis accounts for really only about 2 to 3% of those global emissions from all sources. So those 2% mandates, if you're reducing 2% of a 2% problem, how much environmental benefit is this really? And again, I don't want to get into that, but we are focusing at Clean Fuels about some work and some projects to say, if you have a fixed amount of feedstock, vegetable oils and animal fats in this particular case, what are your best options for carbon reduction? But back to ASTM and D1655, these are the characteristics of how ASTM governs and defines performance parameters within their standards. And so these are the types of parameters and concerns that the aviation community has when developing specifications. So whether or not you're an airframe manufacturer, company like Boeing, an engine manufacturer such as GE or Rolls-Royce, whether or not you're an airline, United, Southwest, foreign companies, foreign governments, all of these type of companies participate at ASTM and play a role in developing the limits and the parameters that we discuss as part of these specifications. D7566 is that specification for synthetic aviation fuels. Currently, there are 8 approved pathways, which are different annexes in that standard, where each is unique to a production facility with unique characteristics, unique feedstocks. And so I mentioned HEFA, those hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids utilize veg oils and animal fats. There are other annexes for Fischer tropes, again, the coal to an aviation fuel. We can use woody biomass. From a technical standpoint, we are at a point where nothing is impossible. We can literally take carbon dioxide out of the air, condense it, and use it, convert it into a liquid renewable fuel. So the issue with that is the technologies to do all of that today aren't competitive with petroleum liquid fuels. A lot of research still ongoing about ways to reduce those costs. Like I say, 8 current approved pathways, but as of today, there's really only one of those 8 types that has any commercial volumes. So each one has its own spec. Each one of those specifications has a maximum allowable blending limit. So none of these annexes or fuels produced to these annexes can be used as a 100% substitute. Every one of them is required to be blended with a petroleum aviation fuel. And the reason for most of that is that the work that's currently been done, a lot of these annexes produce a fuel, and Jesse was showing some slides earlier. They don't have some of the same performance characteristics that petroleum does. They don't have aromatics. They don't have rings of saturates. There are certain components that aren't found in a lot of the synthetic aviation fuels. So to ensure performance, because that engine can't separate, can't determine whether or not you have a synthetic component or a traditional petroleum component, we currently require that all of these synthetic components be blended. Right now, the maximum allowable would be 50%, so that then once it's recertified, it can then be blended and used in an airline. Once it is blended, it's tested to conform to its own annex, its own limits. Once it's certified, then it automatically becomes D1655 compliant as well. And then you can blend it further and further downstream, so long as you maintain those limits. I mentioned, again, aviation fuels and synthetic aviation fuels are all designed to be hydrocarbons. So no oxygenates, no additional compounds. They've got to meet those same performance criteria. So at 38,000 feet, if you're flying across the Atlantic Ocean, it's pretty cold, and you need a fuel that can perform to minus 60 degrees. There are liquid fuels that cannot perform at those temperatures. And so a lot of these parameters, a lot of these limits, take those considerations, specific applications into account. Chemistries are different. And so once these fuels are blended, it is practically impossible to separate those and to easily identify how much of that component was synthetic, how much of it was petroleum-based. In fact, the only way to determine, once it's already been blended, how much of a synthetic component, really it's more of a sustainable component, is through carbon dating, radiocarbon dating, just like you would do with fossils today. There are a couple labs. The lab that developed that process is down in Miami, Florida. Clean Fuels works very closely with them, Beta Analytic. And so we do a lot of work on samples across the country, samples that we get from around the world, to determine what they call the biogenic, or that renewable fraction component. So I've got on here, it's that age-old premise. Yes, it's a hydrocarbon. All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Just because it's a hydrocarbon doesn't make it suitable for use necessarily as a 100% substitute. And then I mentioned here Annex A2 in 7566, that HEPA process is the only one commercially available today. Beats all other commercial volumes from all 7 other annexes combined. Talk a little bit about ASTM. Committee J, that covers the aviation fuel, currently has over 800 members from all over the world. In fact, the last meeting I just attended was earlier this year in Brussels. We had an international meeting. A lot of the members of that were there talking specifically about SAF and policies. These are the technical considerations. And above and beyond the technical considerations, then you've got regulatory adoption and different policies that come into play as well. So obviously in Europe, there's what they call the Renewable Energy Directive, or RED. They've got RED 2, RED 3 directives at this point. In the US, we have the Renewable Fuel Standard, or the RFS. The interesting thing about the US is that synthetic or sustainable aviation fuels are not a mandated fuel. They are not currently part of the RFS, and so there are no mandates, there are no requirements to use those. Europe has adjusted their policies, and earlier this year began incorporating a mandate. So this year, 2% of all the aviation fuel consumed throughout Europe must be a synthetic or sustainable aviation fuel. And over the next several years, that increase, they will increase that percentage accordingly over the next several years. I mentioned ASTM doesn't play a role in enforcement of this. It's a consensus organization where stakeholders and experts come together to agree upon the technical requirements for this. But a lot of it has a different aspect throughout the industry. And so who oversees all this? Well, ASTM covers fuel specification. ASTM covers the infrastructure, the pipelines, how the fuels are moved and distributed throughout the industry. Industry covers the test methods through ASTM. How are we going to measure these properties? What are the limits going to be? The limits would be the specification, compliance. That's all up to industry to develop. Whether or not a fuel is what we would define as fit for purpose. Certain applications require certain fuels with different parameters. The one thing outside of this then would be how this works as an operating limitation within the industry, and that's covered by regulatory authorities such as the FAA. In Europe, their equivalent to the FAA is an organization, EASA. And so those are the regulatory bodies that then step in and mandate that ASTM standards must be used, ASTM test methods, ASTM specs, and or whatever else they deem is worthwhile. So currently, FAA mandates on a worldwide basis that any fuel put into that airframe, into those engines, must meet ASTM D1655. That's why it's so difficult to create new fuels and new limits. Production of SAF, again, volumes haven't really kicked off It's not necessarily a technical issue, although there aren't very many production facilities that have been built. We've seen renewable fuels go through stages where 20 years ago, we saw a boom really in biodiesel production facilities. About 5 or 6 years ago, we saw a boom in renewable diesel facilities, production facilities being built. And it's really only been here in the last year or two. And Jesse talked about those. You've got Montana Renewables. You've got the Marathon Dickinson refinery that was converted to renewable production as well. HF Sinclair has 2 facilities there in Wyoming. Each of those was or is still a petroleum refinery. You cannot produce a synthetic or sustainable aviation fuel outside of those capabilities. So biodiesel producers today can't switch to producing SAF tomorrow. They don't have that infrastructure, that technology to produce that. You need refining capabilities, whether that's a hydrotreater, hydrocracker, other capabilities of such. You need a lot of hydrogen, high pressure, high temperature reactions vessels. So we're seeing very few production facilities sprout up because the policies that are in place don't provide those long-term runways. It's very difficult when you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to produce renewable fuels, different from petroleum. If you're not guaranteed credits, if you're not guaranteed a market, even that 2% mandate in Europe isn't sufficient enough to generate higher volumes around the world today. Without that certainty, we're not going to see a lot of production volumes here over the next year or two. A lot will depend upon the incentives and where that goes, but unless or until some regulatory body comes up with a new program that mandates a lot of this, and as I mentioned, it's not currently mandated as a fuel under the RFS, those limited volumes are going to continue because of that uncertainty and insufficient credits. It is possible to produce both a synthetic and a petroleum aviation fuel simultaneously. You don't have to produce one or the other. Producing them simultaneously is called co-processing. That brings up a whole different set of issues. Knowing exactly how much of that synthetic component exists in your finished fuel would require testing, that radiocarbon dating I mentioned. You've got another webinar here planned in the future to talk about issues dealing with water production from the use of renewable feedstocks. Those renewable feedstocks that are in place today have a lot of oxygen in them. That oxygen has to be replaced. That's why you need a refinery with a lot of hydrogen to do that. And when you mix a lot of hydrogen with oxygen, you produce a lot of water. And so how these facilities are going to handle that, how they're going to handle the heat in that processing, how they're going to handle all of that water content that they generate, and what are the properties of that, all things still being taken into consideration in the marketplace. Happy to answer questions. A little shout out to our funding organizations. Clean Fuels does a lot of its work on behalf of the soybean complex here, and U.S. farmers, whether that's the United Soybean Board, state soybean associations and such. So a huge thanks to them and the work and the funding they provide that allows us to work with the industry as a whole. So
Thanks, Scott.
Jesse? Yeah.
Those are a lot of green logos at the end. Everyone sort of has the soybean and the green leaf. I had a question about the radiocarbon dating, just for my own knowledge. So to see the synthetic or the sustainable fraction, you just look at younger radiocarbon carbons versus ancient ones. That's how you differentiate. Yeah.
Yeah. Petroleum or that, any sort of petroleum source would not have any renewable carbon 14, and there's a known decay rate on carbon 14 to carbon 12. And so, yeah, those laboratories around the world can take those samples. They need just a couple drops, literally, and they can run those samples and determine that decay rate. They take into account some of the carbon-14 that's in the atmosphere today from nuclear testing. And that amount of C14 that's in the atmosphere today has been decreasing since a lot of the nuclear tests were done 50, 60 years ago. And so, yeah, there's a known decay rate, and they can test a lot of those samples and provide turnaround in 2 or 3 days.
One thing I had heard from somebody else about SAF was that the petroleum, the aromatics and stuff help with lubricating and lubricating, but keeping the gaskets, and because the engines were designed to have that, right? So you need to replace those components with something. If you were to use 100%, right, you'd have to modify that SAF. Yeah,
those aromatic compounds, they are known carcinogens, cancer causing, benzene, toluene, xylenes, and other higher compounds. But yeah, they are the compounds that provide swell to gaskets, O-rings, fuel lines that are in place today. There are some additional components, additional material compatibility issues with that. I would say most of that has been addressed, but there are still some instances where the work that the industry has done, we've determined basically that you need a minimum 8% aromatics in the fuel to provide that minimum swell that's still necessary. And so that really becomes your limiting factor, because synthetic aviation fuels usually don't have any aromatics. So how many times can you blend it into there down to that 8% and still maintain that performance parameter?
Well, I guess I'll open it up to anybody else who might have questions, more basic questions. I have some more too, but I'll let everybody else speak up if they'd like.
Yeah, I got a question. Hey, Scott.
Pete.
It's Pete Probst. So I guess I'm wondering, with SAF, is there any issues with current additives that are used for Jet A that may not work with SAF? And I'm kind of looking at this in terms of how renewable diesel, when you're looking at cold flow properties, the typical petroleum cold flow improvers don't really work with renewable diesel. I'm wondering if there's anything similar that needs to be worried about when you're talking about SAF.
And so, yeah, in addition to controlling the performance parameters of aviation fuels, ASTM also has a list of approved additives. So those companies, those airframe manufacturers, those engine manufacturers want to know exactly what's in that fuel. And so you're right. When it comes to renewable diesel, there are different amounts of processing that can be put into it to apply lower cold flow, better cold flow operability. A lot of people choose, particularly in warmer months, to use less processing. That usually means less cost applied to it as well. But then you've got higher cloud points and not as good a cold flow operability. Today's traditional cold flow improvers, those fuel additives that improve that, don't work very well in renewable diesel because of the high straight chain paraffin content. It kind of overwhelms those additives. But for SAF, the processing side of it takes over. So because it's required to have proven performance down below -40, everybody producing SAF adds that additional processing capability to ensure they get that cold flow operability. So additives for cold flow don't come into play here.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, if you can make SAF, you can make renewable diesel that performs good to -40, but then of course you're taking away from a more valuable product. But if there was ever the ability to use some SAF in our diesel engines, that would be great for the cold weather.
And that's always the trade-off is performance and cost. Like I say, we can make any kind of fuel you want with any performance characteristics you want, but at what cost? Would you be willing to pay an extra $1.50, extra $2 per gallon to have a renewable fuel? Some people are, and that's what's been really interesting over the last couple of years, is we've seen a shift, particularly under this administration here in the U.S., away from carbon policy. They have repealed the clean truck rule out in California and put the onus back on the EPA on a lot of things, whereas Europe and some other places that have mandates now are increasing those requirements. So what is the trade-off really is government regulation and government policy, but now here in the US to make up for that, we're seeing a lot of industry and organizational commitment to carbon reduction. Your Walmarts, your Amazons, and companies like that. Nike is a great example as well. PepsiCo, they are willing to pay more for carbon reduction today, whether or not that's in the form of aviation fuels or renewable diesel and biodiesel. They are willing to step up and pay more for the renewable fuel to reduce their carbon footprint.
Neil Ullman from DEQ has a question.
So what you just said, Scott, about how much you're willing to pay for renewable fuel, I'm curious if that's not somebody's goal to have a renewable fuel and to have those warm fuzzies about using something like that, but they're looking at the other benefits. And Jesse's talked about this on previous webinars about how much cleaner it is, how much less you need to deal with filters and things of that nature. And apologies, Jesse, if you've covered this in a previous of these meetings, but from the price of regular petroleum diesel and then the maintenance savings that you get from using RD, like what's the price point difference between RD and petroleum diesel, where if you are willing to pay more upfront per gallon, knowing that long term you're going to be paying less for the maintenance, how much is that difference?
Yeah, we had looked into some projects to try and help define that. It's very difficult. I'd love to be able to tell you that the fuels marketplace is capitalistic and the best sources, the best fuels win. It's not like that. There are so many subsidies, both on the petroleum and the renewable side, that make it very difficult to determine what is the true cost of a fuel. In places like the West Coast here of the US, California, Washington, Oregon, all have low carbon fuel standards. So renewable fuels like renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuels are subsidized currently to some extent so that they become cost competitive. Now there's a cost to doing that. You can see that with the cost of fuels in general in California. But that's a great point, Neil, is yeah, what if I'm not necessarily so concerned about the environment that I want to reduce my carbon footprint, but I am concerned about neighborhood emissions. What is the soot, the PM reduction, the NOx reduction, all of that. There are trade-offs. It's not easily defined what the cost of each of those is, though, as well. And I'll come back to something as simple as fuel economy. It's well known, and we can measure what that energy content is for each of these fuels, whether it's a petroleum baseline fuel, SAF, renewable diesel, biodiesel. And in theory, that energy content ought to translate to fuel economy. If you have less energy per gallon, you should get less fuel economy. What we're finding is that's not true. Energy content is not a good surrogate for fuel economy. And the reason we suspect is, and we're working on proving this, because with the case of biodiesel, let's start there. We have an oxygenated fuel. That oxygenated fuel gives you a higher cetane number. That cetane number means better combustion, lower emissions. What we think is happening is you're actually getting more workable energy from that sample than you did from the petroleum fuel that had all that soot. And the reason what we point back to is when you run energy content, you measure that in an atmosphere of pure oxygen. And so you're measuring that energy in pure oxygen. Problem is, our engines don't operate in an environment of pure oxygen. So what's my measurable energy content of, say, a biodiesel at atmospheric conditions? And compare that to what's my measured energy content of renewable diesel at atmospheric conditions, or a petroleum diesel at atmospheric conditions. And we think that those numbers are going to line up better with something like fuel economy. So back to your question, again, I don't have any hard data that translates into different parameters, different operating conditions, and what that cost is for a consumer.
Yeah, I guess one way you could do it, I mean, engines are so different and technologies are so different and fuels are so different that it'd be almost impossible, but you could do, you could probably get rid of most of the emissions systems on new vehicles if everyone ran renewable diesel. And so there would be a monetary savings right away that you would have to pay on the purchase price of the vehicle, but you can't ensure everyone's going to use renewable diesel.
Yep.
So I saw a question here. If anybody has a question, just unmute yourself. So, so as far as you know, there aren't big strides in the last year or two for cold weather improvers for renewable diesel.
No, not yet. We do have a couple for biodiesel out there now. I can improve the cold flow operability of a B50 blend from soy. So compared to a petroleum diesel fuel, winter operability. So having a cloud point, let's say, or not a cloud point, cold filter plug point. So with traditional filtration. Normally it's about a -17, -18 for petroleum diesel fuel. I can get down to a B50 now, down to about a -16, -17 Celsius as well. And so we're getting about the same cold flow operability of a B50 blend that we do just with traditional diesel fuel. Now, on a really cold day, diesel fuel has its own challenges, but at least we're getting competitive today.
One thing I pointed out on some results I had seen with fuel was a 5% blend of really theoretically almost anything in diesel what can depress that freezing point. And what I saw with the data for renewable diesel was a 5 or up to 7%, I think is what I saw. 7% renewable in petroleum has a lower cold filter plugging point than 100% petroleum with the best additive you can get because of that cold freezing point depression. Like,
yeah, not necessarily, not in all cases. And so I say that because with renewable diesel, it's all about that level of processing. And so there are renewable diesel samples out there that have a cloud point, that temperature where wax first starts to form of around -20. Again, we can get all the way down to -40, just like aviation fuel does. But a good winterized renewable diesel is about -20. There's at least one producer out there here in the US that at least for a short amount of time was having some trouble. The cloud point on their fuel, we were getting samples were about 35 to 40 F. So there was a running joke. I had a colleague up in the Pacific Northwest. The joke was, well, how do you improve the winter operability of renewable diesel up here? And it was add more biodiesel. And we know biodiesel has its challenges, in cold weather. But so my point is there's nothing uniform about this. It depends upon what the feedstock is, who the producer and the production technology, the level and cost monetarily, the level of processing they put into it, all plays a factor in the individual parameters.
any other questions? I had one more. You mentioned when you are hydrotreating the fuel, you're popping those waters off or the oxygens off, you're making water. In terms of the facility itself, does that come out like when you're using hydrogen in a fuel cell, you're spitting out pure water? How does that water come off? Where does it come off? Are you able to capture a clean water? What kind of water is that when that happens?
So it depends upon how clean your feedstock is as well. A lot of refineries today have what they call pretreatment facilities to remove some of the metals content that comes in with the feedstocks. And these are all natural components. Phosphorus, part of the phospholipids that come in these feedstocks. And so, yeah, when you hit it with hydrogen at high temperature, high pressure, that reaction vessel that is taking place in a hydrotreater or a hydrocracker, you're going to get a lot of water fallout that you wouldn't have otherwise had in dealing with petroleum, which is a hydrocarbon to begin with. The purpose of a hydrotreater in a petroleum refinery is mainly to remove sulfur. Now all of a sudden you're asking it to remove a lot of oxygen, produces a lot of water. It's also an exothermic reaction, so now you're dealing with a lot of heat. Water with particular metallurgies can be corrosive as well with hydrogen, and so you're creating some acids, you're creating a lot of water. So the impact is going to be different maybe in every refinery, but ultimately it's never good.
And to be clear, this hydrotreating, that's one place where water comes from. But when we're talking about pre-treatment of feedstocks, that's cleaning up the oils and the fats, right? The pre-treatment water is separate from this. I don't know what the term for that water is. Is there a word for that water?
Correct. Yeah, no, that processed water. Yeah,
Okay.
that pre-treatment is separate from the processed water. And so, yeah, Krista's got a comment in here. Feedstock clean because we pre-treat it. Absolutely. There aren't too many producers that don't anymore. Originally they were, but you could buy a higher level of feedstock, what the industry would have referred to as an RBD oil, refined, bleached, deodorized. So that takes out a lot of that metals content, a lot of those impurities from the beginning. So you can either buy it pre-treated, but most of the refineries, as Krista mentions, they're pre-treating it themselves.
All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, oh, go ahead,
Hey,
Krista.
Jesse, one thing on that produced water, right, from adding the hydrogen and pulling out the oxygen. For some reason, my camera won't turn on. I'm sorry. So we're working on mechanisms so that we can reuse that water within our systems. And to Scott's comment, that's one of the reasons that we need to pre-treat the oil and or our feedstocks through washing it is because of that exact situation where the nitrogen, phosphorus, those naturally occurring metals that are in the oils when they come in, those can have an adverse effect on the actual components on the renewable diesel unit that's operating at high pressure and high heat. And so there's a lot of different moving pieces on this, but the wash water, that's what we call it, the water that comes off of our pretreatment unit, that's separate and distinct. We are also working on ways to potentially reuse that internally as well. And then also the water that we create, we're calling it renewable water because it is, and because it's made with renewable hydrogen and renewable feedstock. We're working on mechanisms to be able to reroute that in our system and to be able to use it to decrease the amount of water that we have to purchase from the city of Great Falls.
And theoretically, that pre-treatment water, you could eliminate that whole thing if you just bought pre-treated oil. And if you railed in clean oil, you wouldn't have to pre-treat it, right? It would just be a huge expense to buy super clean oil.
Arguably, but yeah, that's most likely not going to happen. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at the low CI feedstocks like used cooking oil, that you're never going to get that clean. I guess you can get fancy tallow that, but so for these waste oils, it's I mean, certainly if it's cost competitive, we would look at it. We're looking at it today. But really all we're doing is taking out naturally occurring metals, to Scott's point, and using a giant washing machine to do so. So it's a really effective mechanism to clean up the oil. It's cost effective, and that's going to impact in the end the cost to end consumers.
Oh, Steve had a question, or did you accidentally raise your hand? You had a question, Steve? I think he maybe accidentally raised his hand. Oh, no, he unmuted. You had a question, Steve?
I have to call you back. Sorry. Hey, yeah, Jesse. I've been in the middle of several other things. You guys, I apologize, and my camera doesn't work on this computer for whatever reason. I really needed to see this, so I've asked Jesse if he can send me the video, because I've really got to see everything you guys had to say. I'm working with the Cattlemen's Association and folks up there in Pondera County, and as you know, they're up in arms. And so I really wanted to see what you guys had to say. It's bad timing today.
So Steve, next
yeah.
month, Krista's offered to give more of a presentation focused on the wash water. You got on the end, most of this wasn't, this is mostly about SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, or synthetic aviation fuel, but we just touched on the water thing at the end. But there will be a dedicated, I think, presentation to that specifically, but I did record this and I'll share it with you.
I'm nodding my head. Yes, you can't see that, but thank you so much. And I'm a pilot too, so just the concept of having this kind of clean avgas just blows me away. I'm so happy about it. It's really a great thing. I just feel like there's so many positives to all of this, and we just have to keep everybody happy. Okay.
Well, unfortunately,
thank you so much,
I think avgas, renewable avgas, really isn't a commercially sustainable product, right? That naphtha is going somewhere else, and
Yeah, that naphtha is blended into motor gasoline. If it's captured at all, some facilities are using it back in their cogen, generating power and heat back into the facility as well. So, but like I say, I mean, the interesting thing about it all is we can do whatever somebody wants today from a technical standpoint. The real question is whether or not we're going to be cost competitive.
yeah, I think at one of the talks, the talk I gave on SAF mentioned they can literally make it out of thin air. You take carbon out of the air and hydrogen, you can make renewable diesel from thin air. A lot of energy, not cost competitive, but it's all possible.
Yep.
All right.
for being out of it. Sorry. Thanks, guys.
Oh, you're good. Thanks, Steve. Thank you everybody for showing up. We'll end it there. And so hopefully we'll hear from Krista next month, and email me if you have any questions or any ideas. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much.